Good morning, students. Hope you're safe and well. This lecture is for Monday, April the 13th. When we left off last time, we were discussing World War II and some of the early avenues that took place there. Germany's conquering of most of Europe, their defeat in the Battle of Britain. Germany then turning on the Soviet Union, and although they penetrated deep into Soviet territory, they are finally brought to a halt. Well, let's pick back up and look at the war. We'll go to the Pacific and then we'll go to Europe. And these are going to be two somewhat totally separate theaters of war. But as we think about the Japanese advance, they will occupy French Indochina, which is basically Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia today. And when they do this, the United States will freeze all Japanese monetary assets and American banks, and also stop all oil shipments to Japan. And so this is going to cripple Japan, which, of course, enrages them. And so on December 7th, 1941, it was supposed to be announced to the U.S. Secretary of Defense before the attack on Pearl Harbor took place. But the Japanese ambassadors with the coded message were so inept at what they were trying to do that they actually did not appear to declare war on the United States until after Pearl Harbor was over. Now, the Japanese totally caught the U.S. Pacific Fleet unprepared and unready. Of the big battleships that were at Pearl Harbor, all were either severely damaged or destroyed. About 3,000 lives will be taken that day. Airfields will be destroyed. Many other naval vessels will be severely damaged. And Japan had one purpose. They wanted to cripple the United States in one decisive blow. And they came really close. Two major things will help the United States. Number one, two of the three Pacific aircraft carriers were supposed to be at Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, but they were not there. They did not sail in until later that day. Number two, America's strategic oil reserves that were in the Hawaiian Islands were not struck. So America had fuel. If they could put boats on the water, they had fuel to power those boats. And so these were two mistakes. And as the commander, the Japanese commander, found out that war had not been declared, as his officers and men are celebrating a tremendous victory, and it was, he simply makes a prophetic statement. I am afraid we have done nothing but awaken a sleeping giant and filled him with resolve. Oh, what a prophetic statement that will be. Well, on December 11th, Germany and Italy will also declare war on the United States. And so, whether we wanted it or not, the U.S. is in the war. And by the U.S. and the Soviet Union being drawn into the war, they are going to form a coalition that will interconnect the entire theaters of the war. And yes, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were actually allies. Well, as the attack is going on Pearl Harbor, shortly after, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, Midway, Hong Kong, Thailand, British Malaysia, all of these places will be attacked. Borneo, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and even some Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska will be attacked. Singapore, British Commonwealth, will have to surrender. And the Japanese were maintaining that they would lead Asian peoples to independence from the despised European imperialists. And so this was their propaganda message. And they began pretty much like Germany, an almost unstoppable juggernaut as far as their conquests go. Now, the one thing about bringing the U.S. and the Soviet Union in was the industrial capacity of both nations. Now, what the U.S. is going to wind up doing, and let's realize the U.S. is coming out of a major depression, but they are going to shift into a wartime economy that is literally going to stagger the world. For example, the U.S. automotive industry will produce more than 4 million armored combat and supply vehicles that will be used during the war. And that's just one sample of what's going on. Ships, airplanes, billions, yes, with a B, rounds of ammunition, millions of small arms. The U.S. is going to produce as no one could ever imagine the world. And it is going to be an amazing thing indeed. Okay, so we've got things going on. Now, your textbook kind of divides things up. And so let's look at Europe, because the war will end there first. Moscow will never fall. The battle for Stalingrad, which will finally end in 1943, will result in the first large-scale victory for the Soviets. And from that point on, the Soviets start driving the Germans out and westward. Now, the loss of life on both sides was totally staggering. But the people of the Soviet Union are filled with resolve. And they have one goal only. They intend to crush Germany, whatever it takes. Well, in 1943, Allied troops will move into North Africa. Remember, Italy and Germany, to an extent, were there. In North Africa, the U.S. troops early on will not do well until they are put under the command of, shall we say, an eccentric general by the name of George Patton. Now, Patton had his shortcomings. I mean, he could literally peel wallpaper with his language. But Patton was a general that believed in one thing: you take land once and you never give it back. And so he was a general that was bent on victory. Now, commanding the German armies in North Africa was probably Germany's finest general. And I will say a couple of things about Rommel. He was not a member of the Nazi Party. He was a German soldier. He tended to be a very honorable man. He didn't support the Nazi Party. He simply was a general fighting for his country. But he made one fatal mistake. He, at the end of World War I, was probably the premier tank commander. He knew more about tank warfare than anyone else, and he wrote a book on it. Well, Patton, being a good general and wanting to know his enemy, read the book. You know, if you're going to fight a war, don't write a book on what tactics you might use in that upcoming war. Rommel made that mistake, and Patton will exploit it. And so, U.S. and British forces working together will take North Africa, they will take Sicily, and then they will invade the southern boot of Italy and begin to move up through Italy. And so, slowly but surely, the stranglehold on Europe is beginning to be broken. Ultimately, Italy will surrender. The Italian people will actually turn on Mussolini and execute him publicly. But the Nazis are not going to give up Italy. And so they will rush more troops down there, and it will take almost till the end of the war in Europe for Italy to completely fall. And so the Soviets, the British, and the Americans have some not-so-secret meetings. And Stalin is encouraging in every way he possibly can that the British and Americans start a second front in Western Europe to help the Soviets in dealing with the Germans. And so the plan is drawn up, and the idea is, instead of invading at the narrow point between Britain and France, that the invasion will actually take place at one of the wider points at Normandy. It was less critically defended. And the U.S. will do something very interesting. They'll pull Patton, put him in England, and actually put him in a command of an army that doesn't exist. Oh, you'll have radio conversations. If German spy planes fly over, they see tanks and jeeps and planes and everything else. They just don't realize they're cardboard. It is an army that basically exists on paper because the Germans are determined that Patton will be the one that will lead the invasion. And so when D-Day, as it is called, takes place on June 6, 1944, the Germans hold back for two reasons. One, Patton is not there. Number two, Hitler had a headache, and Hitler took a sedative. And when somebody tried to rouse him, he went into a fit, and everybody was afraid to rouse him so he could release the reserve panzers. So those two failed follow-ups on the part of the Germans will allow the Americans and British and French that got kicked off the beach at Dunkirk to come back in. This will be the largest amphibious attack in world history. Now, at Kursk in Russia, we will have the largest tank attack in history. And the Soviet tank turned out to be a lot more formidable in dealing with the German panzers than the Germans had formerly estimated. And so, a beachhead is established. The Soviets are coming from the east. Now the Western allies are coming from the west. And slowly, methodically, and surely, Germany is being squeezed. Now, total air superiority will be gained by the Allies. And so while the ground war is grinding on, and it literally grinds on, U.S. and British forces are pounding Germany. They are pounding them. Paybacks are tough. Remember, Germany bombed British cities. Well, the Brits are unashamed of bombing and destroying, if they possibly can, German cities. In fact, the German city of Dresden will actually be firebombed. So it just burns to the ground. It's nothing left after the bombing attack. And so methodically, slowly, surely, the U.S. begins to gain the upper hand. Now, Patton does get into the war in Europe, and he does make a significant difference. Believe me, he does. But as we think about this war, part of the problem was the American tank had great difficulty with the Panzers. The Panzer had an 88 millimeter gun on it, and literally American tanks were called rolling coffins. The Panzers had only 2 weak spots from the very rear, because for some reason the Germans had decided to put the fuel tank on the very back of the tank, and underneath. And so what American tank forces would do is pull into the ditches, and they would have the turrets pointed upward. The driver of the tank would actually have the gear, and they were manual transmissions. He would have the gear in reverse, his foot on the clutch. As soon as a German tank started to come over, and realized tanks have to reach a kind of a tipping point before they will lean and go down. And so when the German tanks would first appear above them, they'd fire, pop the clutch, and back out of the way. And this was a way that Patton devised to help destroy German tanks. Well, in December, Hitler will try one last time. He will send a massive invasion toward Belgium and France. It will ultimately be called the Battle of the Bulge, and he will create a tremendous indention in the American and British lines. And it looked, just for a little while, like Hitler might win. Again, Germany makes a huge mistake. Because of the lack of troops, they are now committing SS troops to become combat troops. Now, these are the radical Nazis. These are the people that are driven by Nazi ideology. And so they are brutal, ruthless, I would say totally inhumane. And one of their first acts will be to take a group of American prisoners, put them in the middle of a field, back trucks up, and machine gun them down. Now, this was totally in opposition to the Geneva Convention. And when the word gets out, American troops are filled with a resolve that Hitler probably could have never imagined. Well, part of the Battle of the Bulge will take place around the city of Bastogne, where the 101 Airborne had fought its way to. And the Germans will surround them, and they will demand their surrender. Now, I've actually seen a photocopy of the American commander's answer. The German commander offers surrender terms, we'll treat your troops well, la-di-da-di-da, and possibly they might have. But the American commander gives one of those classic American in-your-face answers. The letter literally reads, to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. And when that letter is given to the German who has come and demanding surrender, he wants to know if it's good or bad. And of course, the sergeant or whoever was driving him tells him, you're going to find out. Well, Patton gets word of this. And Patton always has something to say about everything. And he is quoted as saying, a man that eloquent must be saved. So he will take his armor division. Now, let's realize this is one of the most brutal winters Europe's had in years. And he will move further, faster, and engage more enemy in a winter battle than had ever been done in history. And he will relieve Bastogne. Germany's last major effort has now met with defeat. And soon, Allied forces are going to be crossing into Germany itself. And the Soviet forces are coming through Poland and other areas, and they are going to enter Germany. Now, you would think a leader that cared about his people would allow his army to surrender and do all he could to spare as much of his country as he could. But, you know, I've called Hitler a psychopath, and that's exactly what he was. And of course, what Hitler will do is not allow his generals to surrender. He figures if Germany's going to lose the war, he's going to bring Germany down to its knees because they didn't measure up to his myth. So just one more calculation of this madman and who and what he was. And so the war is going badly. Now, Germany is fighting. Germany will actually get to the point that they'll start executing their own officers that can't stop the enemy, which is tragic. You know, when an army starts murdering its own officers, surely it's a sign that a war has been lost. But Germany will still try to fight on. And so American and Soviet troops will head toward the big prize, the city of Berlin. Now, as per agreement, the Soviets are supposed to be given Berlin. And they will literally have to enter street to street fighting. It is going to be horrific. There will be 12-year-olds that are given weapons and told to go out and defend the fatherland. And the street fighting is going to be horrific. And what the Germans had done, especially to Soviet women when they went into Russia, the Soviet troops pay back in kind as they go into Eastern Germany and finally Berlin. And so ultimately, Berlin will fall. Hitler and a few of his leaders, in order to evade capture, will commit suicide, which was actually, and this sounds awful, a great thing for the world. But Hitler will never be called to pay for his crimes. Some of his henchmen, if I may call them that, will be. There will be some trials at a place called Nuremberg. I'll talk about that again in a moment. And many of these officers will be executed. Their only defense for what they did was, we were following orders. Now, to do immoral, inhuman things is not simply following orders. You may be ordered to do so. But thankfully, in the United States Army, an officer can refuse to obey what is considered an immoral, inhuman command. But the Nazis were so programmed, so wound up, that they followed orders. Now, as the Soviets and as the Allies begin to march across Europe, especially as they begin to get into Germany and Poland and so on, something that was very much suspected is discovered. The concentration camps, the death camps. They start liberating these things. These camps were so horrendous that a hardened soldier like Patton will actually throw up when he first sees one. And you can imagine American troops. They liberate one of these places, and here are these poor, almost starved to death individuals, and what do they want to do? They want to feed them. Let's give them food. Let's fill them up. Well, when you've been starved for so long, if you eat too much, it will actually kill you. And so American troops and British troops especially have to restrain themselves in dealing with these poor, unfortunate individuals. And of course, we talk about the Holocaust. 6 million Jews will be exterminated because Hitler wanted to try to rid Europe, really, of all Jews. 6 million. But there will be 7 million others. Gypsies, handicapped people, mentally handicapped people, Christians. It didn't matter. You spoke against Hitler, you were going to be in trouble. The premier German theologian in the 1930s was a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Brilliant. Loved in Germany, loved in America. In fact, when World War II actually breaks out, he is visiting in the United States, and people beg him not to go back to Germany. But Bonhoeffer will make the threatening statement, air quotes, if I'm not in Germany when it falls, how can I be a part of Germany's rebuilding? Now, that was a very sacrificial type of statement. But a megomaniac like Hitler will obviously take that very personally. And though Bonhoeffer probably knew some people that were involved in conspiracies against Hitler, he himself was personally never guilty of so. But he will be hung before the Soviets can liberate the work camp to which he is assigned. So that's how Hitler operated. You speak against him, he was going to take you out of the way. And so we have the Holocaust. And really, as you think about it, students, the Holocaust is Darwinism followed to its logical extent. Survival of the fittest. Late 19th century, eugenics, scientific racism. These are superior people, these are inferior people. And so, it is a logical outcome of Darwinism. Sinister, horrific, but an outcome. Now, another American in-your-face thing in Europe. Of course, we have a very segregated army, but there will be quite a group of young African Americans that will train for the Army Air Corps. Notice I said that. During World War II, there was no United States Air Force. It was the Army Air Corps. And these guys will train. And when they get to Europe, they're given one job. You fly fighter escort for the bombers. Don't go chasing after German fighters to try to get a bunch of kills. You guard the bombers. Because most white pilots, as soon as the German decoys appeared, they were going to go chasing off. And of course, the bombers would be very, very vulnerable. Well, bomber pilots came to love the Tuskegee Airmen. But the Tuskegee Airmen did a very interesting thing. All the tails of their planes were painted bright red. And there was a reason for that. Nazi, somebody you think is inferior, is shooting you down. And they will become one of the most decorated air units in the history of the United States because they did their job. A lot of racial prejudices will actually be broken down when white bomber crews start buying drinks for the black fighter pilots. A lot of stereotypes are going to begin to crumble down. So, a few in-your-face things that the United States will do in the German theater of the war. Okay, let's go back to the Pacific. Well, basically, in the Pacific, it didn't look like Japan could be stopped. But in May of 1942, at a naval battle called the Coral Sea, the Japanese advance will stop. Basically, Coral Sea is a draw. It was not an American victory. It was only a moral victory. But in the process, the U.S. broke the Japanese code and figured the next big point of attack was going to be Midway Island, which actually Midway Island was in a position where Japan itself could be attacked from there. And so the Japanese have no idea the Americans know where they are going. And so in June of 1942, all 4 carriers that were present at Pearl Harbor are headed toward Midway Island. The U.S. has 3 carriers. The Japanese are on one side of the island, the Americans are on the other. The Japanese cluster their carriers. The Americans separate theirs. And so, as the battle will take place, the American pilots will ultimately wind up following Japanese pilots back to their carriers. And in the course of the day, all 4 carriers that were present at Pearl Harbor will go down. It will be a tremendous American victory. And of course, this then will become the turning point in the war in the Pacific. Now, an interesting point. Just as the American fighters followed the Japanese fighters, some of the Japanese fighters will follow American fighter planes back toward Enterprise. And they will bomb Enterprise. Enterprise will be on fire. It will be dead in the water. Now, the Enterprise crew will do a remarkable job indeed. They will be able to get the fires out. They will actually get the boilers relit, and Enterprise will be under steam. So when the Japanese come back, of course, they're assuming, like themselves, the Americans have all their carriers clustered. They see a carrier moving, and they have no idea that the flight deck of that plane is so thin that if a seagull landed on it, it would fall through. And so they bomb Enterprise again. But Enterprise, taking 2 bombings and ultimately sinking, will actually save the Wasp and the Hornet. And the Wasp and the Hornet will be able to finish the job. So, what do we do after a major victory? The U.S. decides on an island hopping policy. In other words, we're not going to take every island. We're going to take certain strategic islands that will move us closer to the point where we can attack the Japanese mainland. Now, let me assure you, at the beginning of the war, the Japanese said not one American bomb would ever fall in Japan. They were wrong, but that was their brag at the beginning of the war. And so, methodically, slowly, surely, and very, very hard fought, island after island will be taken. Now, some people say, why were the Japanese forces so difficult to defeat? Part of it was religious. Their religion was Shinto. Shinto involved a worship of the state. Like most Asian people, you do not offend the ancestors. And so surrender was a horrific thought to the Japanese. It was better to die than to surrender, because surrender insulted everyone and everything. And so this is one of the reasons things would be so bitter. Often on these islands, the Japanese would have their families, and you would have women and children commit mass suicide because they had been told horrific stories about what the Americans would do if they were captured. Actually, the horrific stories were about what the Japanese had done in Nanking and other places in China. But this fighting is going to be tenacious. Tenacious indeed. 2 of the most bloody campaigns are going to be on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And during these battles, the Japanese will introduce someone else into the war. They will take young Japanese men, they will teach them how to take off in an airplane. They don't need to learn how to land because that's not their goal. And then they will send them on a mission loaded with fuel, loaded with bombs, and their goal is one thing indeed: to try to fly that plane into an American ship and do as much damage as they can. They will be called kamikazes, divine wind. And yet, again, because of that Japanese religion, because of that Japanese pride, many a young man will step up and try to do this. So as we get to the point that B-29 bombers are pounding the mainland of Japan, and still Japan's resolve is, we're not going to surrender. In this process, Roosevelt dies. He doesn't get to see the victory. Harry Truman will take over as president. And Truman is faced with a tremendous dilemma. How do we bring Japan down with as little loss, obviously, of American life, but of Japanese life as well? So in March of 1945, Tokyo will be firebombed. just like Dresden had been done by the British. It was hoped dropping these incendiary bombs and burning the capital city would bring the Japanese people to their knees. It did not. But in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, up near Knoxville, a little secret project had been going on since the surrender of the Germans. And that secret project wound up developing two, shall I call them, super weapons. Two weapons the world had never seen before. An atomic bomb. And so, to save definitely American lives, but ultimately Japanese lives, because Truman knew we would have to fight street to street, house to house, to be able to take Japan. He will order first, on August 6th, the bombing of the city of Hiroshima. 70,000 lives will be incinerated in a moment. The city will be a complete destruction. One bomb. One bomb. So intense was that bomb that in the Smithsonian Institute there is a lunchbox of a little Japanese child. And inside the lunchbox, the food was actually carbonized. That's how intense it was. Well, Japanese resolve is still not broken. So on August 9th, 1945, the United States will bomb the industrial city of Nagasaki. 40-something thousand will die. And finally, on September the 2nd, 1945, the Japanese will formally surrender to the United States. And the most horrific, destructive war in the annals of humanity will finally come to an end. The costs were unbelievable in lives, in cities, in everything. It was a horrific situation. Okay, so that looks at the war itself. And we'll just kind of pause here. We'll pick up again in a little while talking about the aftermath. So in this total war, civilian death tolls will actually exceed military casualties. And that's a horrific thought. But that's where warfare had come by the 20th century. Both Japanese and German occupying armies were notorious for exploitation, for slave labor, and so on. In some of the countries, especially in Europe, you will have business people and companies that will often collaborate because they figured they could continue to prosper even if the Nazis or the Japanese were in control of their country. And of course, they will normally be hated by the average citizens. But not everybody just idly sat back, idly folded their fingers, and thought, there's nothing we can do. And so you will have resistant groups form, especially throughout France. And they will use sabotage, disrupt communications, disrupt rail lines, whatever they can do. They will actually have armed assaults on small patrols of people. They will assassinate individuals if they possibly can. You will have average citizens sheltering wounded Allied soldiers after the invasion and sheltering pilots when they're shot down. You will have average citizens even try to shelter Jews, hiding them in their homes, in attics, wherever they might could, trying to help them evade capture. And so lots of people are going to suffer and sacrifice behind the scenes, because when an invading army comes in and takes over, obviously they're going to use up everything they want and need to use, and any scraps that might be left over then will be left over for the people that they have captured. They would torture, they would execute civilians. If they suspected you in any way, you were pretty much dead. And so it was a horrific time. Horrific time. And after the war especially, there's going to be a lot of reprisals on men, businessmen, women, whoever, that collaborated with the enemy. So World War II was a war of extreme brutality on the military side. And then it was a war of extreme atrocities visited upon average citizens and people as they were just simply trying to survive. And so it was a horrific thing indeed. Now, women really came to the forefront. Women will actually fight in the Soviet army. Women will enter the American industry, and they will build ships and planes and tanks and everything else. In fact, we will actually have a women's professional baseball league for a while. So women are going to step up in big, big ways. You will have a women's branch to the military. Women will serve as nurses and doctors. They will serve in communication areas and so on. And women are going to be involved in sabotage, in trying to disrupt communications. So women are going to be so very much active in the war, and of course very much helpful in winning the final victories. And then on the other hand, as soon as the war is over and the young men start returning home, the women are said, well, you need to go back home now, and let the young men get their jobs and so on. Now, another interesting thing about the Pacific War, and this is one of those parts of history that to me is amazing. The way the United States had treated the Native Americans. I mean, if I was a Native American, I would want absolutely nothing to do with anything that was the United States. And yet, during World War II, many Native Americans will come out and serve in the American military, none less than the Navajo Indian tribe. Now, the Navajos had done something unique. They had retained their language. Yes, they spoke English, but they still used the Navajo language. And the U.S. Army in the Pacific picked up on this really quick, that the Japanese were breaking our codes. But what if we sent a bunch of Navajos to be radio operators and they just spoke their native language? It wouldn't be a code. It would be a native language. And so they decided to do that. By the way, the Japanese never broke the language barrier. Now, what is interesting, these young men entered Army units knowing that if there was a chance they were going to be captured, that they would be shot and killed by their own comrades. But they still volunteered and served. And they performed a tremendous task and made a tremendous contribution to the American war effort in the Pacific. And again, why? I don't know. I don't know. But they did. By the way, the famous raising of the flag on Suribachi on Iwo Jima, you know, the 5 Marines putting it up, the man at the very back was a Native American. And so here was a Native American serving in a unit. Now, was the United States totally pure during the war? No, they weren't. Of course, after Pearl Harbor, the immediate fear was the west coast of the United States will be invaded. And there were a lot of Japanese Americans living on the west coast. And the United States will actually create detention camps. And Japanese Americans, citizens, will be rounded up and put in these camps because there is such a phobia and fear that these people will ally with their home nation and turn on their adopted country. And so, yes, the United States actually did that. Now, there will be some Japanese Americans that will serve in the United States Army in World War II, but they will always be assigned to units that are in Europe. Obviously, in Japan, fighting in the Pacific, they could blend in with the enemy, and that was a fear. And in Europe, they could not do so. There will be Jews who will fight in the United States Army. And they realize that if they wind up being captured in Europe, their deaths will probably be horrific indeed. And yet, many Jewish Americans will wind up fighting. So, what a war. What an impact. What a century. To think about the 2 most defining elements of the entire 20th century are 2 major world wars that changed war forever. Well, what happens in the aftermath? Most of Europe is in ruin. There are millions of homeless people in Europe. There are millions of families that have been separated as a result of the war, and lots of them will never get back together again. Cities are in ruin, and another sense of hopelessness descends upon Western Europe. Japan, obviously they have been brought to their knees, and there is great, great destruction among the Japanese people, their homeland, and so on. And so who emerges the power? And actually there will be two. The two allies, the United States and the Soviet Union. They emerge the two major powers in the world. Now, as I noted, during the war they were allies. They worked together. But almost as soon as the war is over, paranoia, suspicion, distrust, all of these things begin to occur in such a way that the two allies are shortly no longer allies. They become formidable enemies. And so historians will say, well, at the end of World War II, there were two superpowers. And as far as the rest of the world was concerned, that was true. Now, for a long time, it was suspected that the Soviet Union was pretty much equal in every way with the United States. We later found out that wasn't entirely true. And so the United States will emerge as the major superpower in the world, but it is squared off against the communist ideology of the Soviet Union. And so both powers decide to create a world in their own image. And so the Soviet Union is going to kind of gobble up Eastern Europe. They want buffer states between them and Germany. Germany is actually carved up four ways: a French, British, American, and Soviet sector. Ultimately, the French, British, and American will come together, and that will form the nation of West Germany. But as we think about death tolls and post-war settlements, your textbook estimates that at least 60 million people perished in World War II. And after all of this destruction, after all of these things that had taken place, one of the most amazing things to me about World War II is what some of the common GIs did when they got home. They picked up, they grabbed a Bible, and they went back to some of the places where they had fought. And their intent was to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with the suffering masses in Europe and Asia. It was a great revival movement, folks. And it was not done by professional theologians, by trained preachers. These were just average guys going back, trying to share Christ with a group of suffering people. And, you know, it's a thing most textbooks don't bring out, but it's something that I think is very, very important. Well, as American troops are scattered throughout these nations, they're also spreading, shall we call it, Americanism. And so Europeans, Asians, and others are getting a good idea what being a part of the United States could be. And so Americanism appeals to a lot of people, and that scares the Soviets to death. So they will suppress all political parties in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and they will impose a communist government under Soviet thumb in those particular nations. Well, Truman immediately turns around and declares America the champion of the free world, a freedom-loving people everywhere. And so here the two former allies have now kind of squared off against one another. And so what's going to happen? Truman will come up with a policy that will be called containment. And that policy is that we will defend anyone, any nation, anywhere that wants to remain free under the threat of communism. Now, we don't do anything for those Eastern European states, but supposedly this is the commitment for the world, that we're going to do what we can to keep communism from spreading in the world. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, isolationism is dead in the United States. The United States will never be an isolationist nation again. We're going to be engaged in world affairs. In fact, someone will call the United States the policeman of the world. But as this division occurs over the European continent, Churchill will make the statement. Of course, Churchill made a lot of brilliant statements during the course of the war. He will say that a giant iron curtain has descended upon Europe. And you know, maybe that's a really good way of expressing what took place. You have two superpowers who no longer trust one another, who are basically looking down the barrel of a gun at each other, whose ideologies are diametrically opposed to one another, and the world kind of takes its breath in and wonders what is going to happen next. And what will happen next is what we call the Cold War. World War II was a hot war. People were shooting at each other and trying to destroy each other all the time. The war that will follow, that will pretty much go to the end of the 20th century, will be a Cold War. Oh, there will be some casualties all along the way, but at least it will never erupt into a war like World War II. But both sides are going to begin tremendous military buildups. Both sides are going to develop nuclear weapons, and in doing so, literally both sides will develop enough nuclear weapons that they could have destroyed the entire world. And so, the Cold War is going to put the world into another sense of paranoia. What's going to happen next? Well, this is a good stopping point. So we'll end here, and we'll pick up on Wednesday at this point. And students, again, I hope you're staying safe. Everything is going well with you.